We were all wrong about the powers of absolute Scarecrow. Well, the cigarette's right, but everything else we were wrong about. We had no clue. So we're gonna do this out of order. We're gonna start with absolute Scarecrow first. We will get to the absolute Robins, but we're gonna start with absolute Scarecrow first. So, what this does is this opens with Bruce Wayne going to Blackgate Penitentiary. Right? Now, the way that he's able to sneak in, there's a whole reason for that. And we'll talk about that here in a little bit because it's pretty dope. But he basically goes to the prison cell of Joe Chill. Now, one of the things to remember that we've seen so far is that Joe Chill was the person responsible for the death of Bruce Wayne's father, Thomas, and that Bruce himself has been going to visit Joe. But this is one of like the first times that we actually see him showing up as Batman to meet with Joe. And Joe's just kind of standing out there, looking out the window. We don't know exactly what he's doing, but there is something that he's doing. Because what ends up happening is that when Batman shows up, he just says, "Say it, Chill." And Chill asks him what he's talking about. He's like, "You can't be here." And he starts calling for the guards. And Batman tells him to shut up. And he says, "No one on Earth can protect you from me, not until I hear that it's a lie." And Joe asks him, right, "I don't know what you're talking about. What are you referring to when you say that it's a lie?" And Bruce just says, "I was given files by Jim Gordon, files that claim it was all some setup. The science fair challenge, the winning project, the trip to the zoo, and you." Now, for those of you guys who don't know what we're talking about, who are joining us for the first time, Thomas and Martha Wayne were not gunned down in an alleyway the way it traditionally happens in the Batman mythos. In the Absolute Universe, it was a science fair that Bruce Wayne had won, and that as a result, they were given a trip to the zoo. Thomas is the one who took them because he was the teacher for the classroom. Thomas is the one who was gunned down. Martha's got a whole different story, and we'll kind of hit back on that here in a second. But the files that he was given by Jim Gordon in the last issue, those basically seem to detail the fact that there was way more to the story of Bruce than we initially thought there was, that we're learning about it in real time. And so where Joe Chill kind of plays dumb, he's like, "Me, what are you talking about?" The response of Bruce is he says, "Yes, you. The files say that you were part of it somehow, that you went to the zoo with a specific target, Thomas Wayne, that it was all some plot, but his son Bruce, he comes here every month to talk with you, always looking for some answer to why you did it, and you give him nothing but mumbles and whispers. That man, he pores over the tapes, trying to decipher them, decipher you, all in an effort to understand, to stop it from happening again to some other kid. All the forces that made you, the complex circumstances, but now you're going to tell me it's that simple, that you were some agent of some master plan. No, but you know something. Why else would you suddenly stop talking to Bruce Wayne? And it's just a coincidence that they move you to this new wing right after that. Now, this is the rabbit hole that Bruce Wayne's going down, learning all this information for the very first time. Now, of course, Joe Chill starts calling for the guards and nobody ever really shows up. And Bruce Wayne screams at him every single time, right? He says, "Say it," right? "Say that it's a lie." But in the midst of that, Scarecrow shows up. Now, here's our first clue that there's something much bigger going on here, because Scarecrow basically shows up here in a prison cell that is empty, with nothing but a small little window to get out of. And the window's too small for someone to pass through, otherwise, why even put them here? If all they have to do is go through the window to leave, right? But as soon as Batman sees Scarecrow, he recognizes him, right? You killed Jim Gordon. And the response of Scarecrow, "Me? I heard it was you, but my guess, it just became too much for him. It happens a lot these days." Now, that's one of the sticky situations to remember. In the last video that we covered, we didn't directly see Scarecrow kill Jim Gordon. That's the crazy thing, is because what we saw was Jim Gordon babbling on and going crazy, and then basically jumping off the building and ultimately dying. Of course, Bruce Wayne tried to catch him, but he fell and died anyway because Bruce Wayne only caught his coat. But notice something about that moment, right? Scarecrow was on the other side of the street in a building smoking a cigarette. His face was lit up just enough for Batman to know what he looked like. It was effectively Scarecrow waving at him, right? And letting him know he was the one behind it. But that's something to point out here, right? At the very beginning of the last issue that we did, Scarecrow blew cigarette smoke at a guy's face. That guy ends up going crazy and killing his best friend. That's basically what happens here, right? Because Scarecrow stands up and blows cigarette smoke into Joe's face and says, Joe, how about you let the two of us talk? Maybe go make your bed. And Joe just says, sure. Good idea. Now, on the surface, it looks like the cigarette smoke makes him susceptible. So you guys were right when you were saying the cigarette smoke is seemingly the source of his power, right? The fear toxin, quote unquote. But this is not traditional fear toxin. You don't see Joe Chill freaking out, right? Seeing spiders all over his body or something crazy like that, right? He actually ends up going and doing something of his own volition, and he's not directed to do it by Scarecrow, right? That's the crazy thing about this. You guys see what I'm talking about, right? Because at that point, he turns and looks at Batman and says, now, forgive me, but I have to say, it's so nice to finally talk to you face to face after all these years, Bruce. So he knows who he is, right? And he says, I get why you're angry though. I do. None of this makes a lick of sense. The Batman Project, some big decades-long conspiracy to make you into this, but that's because you're missing the key, the reason for it. Why you, of all people? But see, that's the best part. And that's where Bruce just kind of says, why would I listen to you? You're just another one of his crazy operatives. And this is where Scarecrow gets dope, because he says, I could be. Maybe I am some operative, traveling the world, toppling governments, causing panic, yada, yada, yada. Or maybe I'm just a straw man out for a walk. But we are here to talk about you. He's very coy on what his purpose is, but we kind of start figuring out, right, little bits and pieces that we get over this conversation. God, this comic is incredible, because he says, why in the hell was this all done to you? And the reason is your mother, Bruce, because Martha, she was a loyal member of the Court of Owls, a terrorist. That's true. He's not lying, right? We learned about that recently. His mom was a member of the Court of Owls. She essentially defected, and the Court of Owls was seemingly just destroyed, or at the very least pushed to the brink of total annihilation at the hands of Absolute Joker. We don't know how that played out. We don't know what took place there, but seemingly we know that it did. And the funny thing about this, right, Bruce just like reaches through the cell, becoming emotional, goes to grab for Scarecrow. He pops out a butterfly knife and stabs this guy through the arm. And Bruce is just sitting there, right, holding his arm. And at that point, he just calls Scarecrow a liar. And Scarecrow goes on this amazing monologue where he says, I'm afraid not, buddy. It's the one part Gordon hid from you. God rest his troubled soul. He figured it'd be too much, but it's true. In fact, it's where your mother ran off to, their super secret headquarters, though from what I hear, that didn't end too well either. And so when he sees Bruce just kind of learning all this, he's like, what? Is your mind reeling, denying all of it? Just think back to that day at the zoo. You really don't remember any signs, a cawing from high above. You remember. I know it's hard, realizing your whole life was just some grand project, but the good news is that it's not. See, Grimm and I, we thought it would be funny, after all. What's the natural prey of an owl, Bruce? That's right, a bat. That's the why of your life. Batman is not a project. He's a joke. Are you done making your bed yet, Joe? And that's where you find out that what Joe Chill has been doing is basically building himself a noose, right? Like, he wasn't told to do that by Scarecrow. He did it of his own accord. And so that's the next little hint that we get to the nature of the Scarecrow's powers. Because when Batman sees it, he's like, Chill, what are you doing, right? And he says, stop him, right? Why are you doing this? And that's where Scarecrow says, why, right? They say we live in an age of fear, but me, I disagree. Imagine a farmer 100 years ago. He feared tangible things that might come after his crops, pests, drought, things he could understand, things he could protect against. But these days, that same farmer sits inside the dark, fearing things too big to comprehend, let alone affect. 1,000 of them. War, plague, societal collapse, global conspiracies, all while his crops rot outside. And he says, that's not fear. That's something newly grown, something special. That's dread, knowing it's only a matter of time until one of them comes slouching toward us. And you can hear it, can't you? The ticking of that clock, tick, tick, tick. We all can, and we're all friends in dread. So, why am I doing this? Because, Bruce, we live in an age of dread, and I, for one, think it's wonderful. And so in that moment, Joe Chill cuts the line and dies. And so Batman just reaches through and is like, I will tear you apart. And Scarecrow just says, I guess that's my cue to walk on. And he says, but you take care, Bruce, and please keep digging. There's a lot more to discover, and I promise it's so much worse than you think. And he goes to like leave, but notice this scene right here. right? Notice this, like when he pushes Joe Chill's body out of the way and starts walking away, he just kind of disappears and the crows appear, right? And they just fly through the window. So seemingly he's the crows, right? Like he takes on the form of the crows. That's how he gets in and out of places. He is the crows and the crows are him, which is why he can appear in one place and the crows can be up in the sky at the same time. But more so than that, notice what happened to Joe Chill, right? He blows the smoke in his face and then Joe Chill goes and hangs himself, right? He didn't tell him to. He didn't say, go hang yourself, Joe. That didn't happen. Joe did it of his own accord. What I would argue is the powers of the Scarecrow remove inhibitions and drive people to engage in the worst actions for themselves or potentially others, right? I mean, just jump back to the last comic that we covered, right? As a quick aside here, Scarecrow walks up on Buck and blows smoke in his face, right? And then he tells him, Vern, your best friend, has been sleeping with your wife. Buck looks down at his phone and he sees that there, right? And that's when he freaks out and then he attacks Vern and kills him, right? So he was driven to madness, right? Driven to madness by a truth, something that was actually happening. And in fact, in that moment, he comes out after he's overcome with anger and is like, oh my God, what have I done, right? I was just so angry, that kind of thing. And then think about Jim Gordon, right? Like when presumably Scarecrow blew the smoke in Jim Gordon's face, or potentially replaced one of Jim Gordon's cigarettes with his own, which explains what it was that was going on with Gordon when he initially seemed lucid and relatively reasonable when he was talking to Batman. And then as he starts smoking the cigarette, just kind of starts going crazy, right? And it's also why it is that it looked like Scott Snyder hyper-focused on the cigarette, right? So presumably he was infected with the fear toxin the same way, but then he ends up jumping off the building, which is something that's very uncharacteristic for Gordon and something that he never would have done. I mean, even the artwork reflects the fact that he kind of starts going mad the longer he's talking to Bruce. And then in this particular instance, you've got Joe Chill who goes and hangs himself in the cell as if it's what he felt like he deserved because he felt so terrible about what he'd done, right? This is what I'm talking about. Like, the powers of the Scarecrow are a whole different beast than what they used to be. And I would go so far as to say, this actually makes him deadlier, right? This actually makes him much, much deadlier. And so what we end up doing here is we jump back to how Bruce even ended up at the prison cell in the first place, because you pick up with this interview that's being done, where they talk about the Robins, right? And Buzz, the reporter, keeping in mind this is all just propaganda, right? Being controlled by the powers that be. In this particular instance, Jack Grimm, absolute joker, right? That Buzz says it's wild. The program hasn't even launched yet, and already Gotham seems to have fallen in love with the Robins. Everyone has their favorite. So what do you think is the secret to their popularity, Mayor Hill? And Mayor Hill just says, because they're not Batman. Right? That's really what it is. Batman's dark. Batman's twisted. He's made Gotham worse. And he says, these brave young men and women have each suffered great personal tragedy, yet they use it as motivation to make the world better. Whatever dark forces created the Batman, he's chosen to gleefully lash out at Gotham through terror and violence. He's an agent of chaos, a cowled prince of crime. Now, this stands in stark contrast to Batman in the main DC universe, because one of the biggest criticisms you see from people who just don't really know anything about Batman in the comics is that, well, he never does anything to make Gotham better, right? He just runs around in the night, dressed as a rodent, attacking anybody for committing any crime. No, Batman uses his wealth in a lot of ways to make Gotham City better in the main DC universe. But here in the Absolute universe, he's a construction worker. He doesn't have billions of dollars. His dad was a teacher, his mom is a social worker, right? He doesn't come from like exorbitant levels of wealth. So he's doing the only thing he can do, and the only thing he knows how to do, which is to use whatever skill set he has to strike back at these forces operating behind the scenes that everybody in the city and really everybody in the world is so ignorant of. Not because they choose to ignore it, but because these powers operate on such a high level and in incredible levels of privacy and secrecy, no one's even aware that they exist. I mean, we know that from Absolute Alfred, who was telling Batman about Joker, right? He doesn't even know what his real story is. It's just rumor and hearsay, and Alfred just tells him what he thinks Joker's story is, but no one really knows, right? And that's kind of the bonkers thing. And so what ends up happening is that Barbara Gordon, the daughter of Jim, right, she hits him up and is like, please tell me that you didn't do this. Please tell me you didn't kill my father, because she doesn't know for sure. She wasn't there. And propaganda is a hell of a thing, right? People are hardwired to need answers. And in the face of a lack of answers, they'll make answers up, or they'll go with whatever answers make the most sense based on their worldview. And so when you have a scenario where Jim Gordon dies, people see Batman on the roof, and there's no hard and fast answers outside of what they suspect and what they're told by the news, then that's when they come to believe exactly what happened. That's the power of propaganda in the absolute universe. The news says Batman killed Jim Gordon. People saw Batman at the rooftop. Batman killed Jim Gordon. And they don't ask any questions after that because it's just easier not to. And so at that point, you have Alfred, who's literally knocking on the door, trying to get to Bruce, and is like, kid, it's been days. I'm gonna need some proof of life or something. And then here comes Harley Quinn, just like running up on the door with a mallet, right? And Jim Gordon's just like, Miss Quinn, it's a computerized vault. A simple hammer won't do that. And she's like, it's not a hammer. It's a 92,000 volt magnesium amplified double lithium electrochemical thunder mallet 92. Nothing I use is simple, Jeeves. Now move. Now I gotta say, man, I love Harley Quinn. I've always loved Harley Quinn ever since she debuted in Batman the Animated Series, and then they rolled over into the comics. But I gotta be honest, man, I like this version of Harley Quinn better. Right? And so once she smashes the door down, Bruce Wayne's gone, right? And that's when they start combing over these files, and Harley realizes how deep this goes. But keep in mind, the files only go so deep. Right, they provide the surface level information. They started Bruce on this journey. Everything else he's gonna have to uncover, which was not covered in the files. But that's the moment when he had taken off and then went to Blackgate prison. And so at that point, you switch over to Waylon Jones and Absolute Riddler. Now keep in mind, when it came to Waylon Jones, yes, he became Killer Croc, but in the Absolute Batman and the Absolute Wonder Woman crossovers, that Bruce had basically attained a device that Waylon Jones can wear that allows him to revert back to his human form. So we're finally seeing that happening. It looked like Snyder was teasing that Waylon Jones could never really go back to being human. He would just kind of be like a humanoid reptilian form, but no, he looks like a normal human being. And that's when he goes to see Edward Nygma, because they were all friends when they were younger before Bane got to him. And he's just like, we have to help Bruce, right? He's lost in his own head. And Eddie's just looking at all these screens with his brain hooked up to a computer because Bane crushed half his skull and this is the only way for him to stay alive. But he's almost kind of becoming a living computer. He's like answering all these questions that he sees, presumably on Jeopardy. And Waylon's just like, I get it, okay, right? You have every right to be angry at Bruce. We all do. But can you at least look at me when I'm talking to you? And that's where Nygma manifests on the screen and is like, I am looking at you and I'm not angry anymore. I'm just occupied. We are all occupied, Waylon. And that's where Waylon's just like, occupied or not, right? We have to figure this thing out. And Eddie's just like, what are you talking about? Figure what out? And Waylon just says this, the way forward. Where's Harvey? And Eddie just shows him a picture of Harvey. And Harvey Dent is at a club that he now owns. And he's watching all this unfold. But notice this, he's falling into the traditional role of Harvey Dent, Two-Face, right? Flipping the coin. Although in this instance, it's a casino chip. I have no doubt it'll become a coin at some point along the line. His face is half scarred. We know that because Bane lit half his face on fire, mutilated him that way. But he's falling into the darker part of himself. Because again, we're told by Eddie, 31 cases in all. Killers, thieves, set free because of Harvey's partnership with Batman. So yeah, Harvey's occupied because there was no way for the prison system to know that when Batman brought those guys in, that they weren't coerced into a confession. And so because of the fact that the legal system was compromised by Batman's actions and vigilantism, they had to set him free until they commit another crime, in which case they'd be charged, arraigned, and maybe thrown in jail after being found guilty. Who knows? But then at that point, Waylon asks about Oswald, right? And that's where you switch over to him, where he's told, like, I don't know, boss, maybe we call it a night tonight. Everybody went to Cosmos. The dance floor is dead out there. And Oswald's just like, it's 10 o'clock, right? Who doesn't show up to a bar at 10 o'clock? If people were gonna show up here, they would start filing in. And so he says, tell DJ Tundra to blast it, crank up the dry ice. And he's told, Tundra went to Cosmos too, and took the ice with him. And so in that moment, Oswald just says, fine, right? Let's go to Cosmos then, if that's the place to be. Get my dancing shoes, Mo, the bright, shiny gold ones, and get the C4, because they're gonna blow the place to pieces. But they've all basically become villains, right? That's the craziness of it. But there's also tragedy here, and that's what Nygma talks about, because he says, like I said, everyone is occupied. And so Waylon Jones, seemingly the lone voice of reason, which I love the way he's written here, right? He says, enough, we are all falling apart here. Get off this occupied bullcrap, will you? And that's where Nygma says no. Occupied as in occuper, original meaning to seize control of a place. We're like cities that Bane sacked, each one of us burned to the ground. And now we're not falling apart, we're trying to put ourselves back together, take back some modicum of of control. Now, that's an important statement here. Whenever people feel violated on a very personal level, regardless of what that violation happens to be, psychological, physical, there is an effort to regain control. You see it all the time, and how they regain control happens in a variety of ways. Somebody who was victimized might wear shoes to bed, so that if it ever happened again, they could just run away. It's the only way for them to psychologically cope with what happened. Maybe somebody who was in a terrible car crash buys a gigantic SUV, or maybe somebody buys a handgun if they were burglarized or they were mugged. Whatever the case is, people grasp for some semblance of control when they feel like they're in an environment where they have no control. And that's where all of Bruce Wayne's friends are. That's where every single one of them are at, grasping at straws, trying to retake some measure of normalcy in this life so they can put themselves in a position to where they're quote unquote never violated again. And that's what Nigma's talking about here, because Waylon Jones chimes in and says, they burn me down too. And Eddie responds and he says, of course, I know that, but you are fixed now, Waylon, and I am happy for you, truly, but I can still feel the parts of my brain that are not as fast or accurate as they were before. It's like this riddle that I can't solve, like this core piece of me is missing, and I don't know if it's ever going to come back. You don't know what that's like, not anymore. And Waylon says, actually, I do, right? Because every time I look in the mirror, number one, I see the physical representation of what they did to me, and even if I didn't see that, I would still recall it, right? I was caught up in this just like everybody else. Do not let my physical form fool you, right? But it's a very powerful message that he makes here, because he says, and how we seize back control is together. That's the answer to your riddle. People are hardwired to need people, to exist in groups, but more so than that, friendships, family, that's what makes life valuable, and it's what makes life worth living. I know it may sound a little hippy-dippy, but being in the company of people who legitimately care about you makes life feel great. And that's what Waylon Jones is hitting at here, right? We grew up together. We struggled together. We went through this together. Bane came after us together. And so the only way for us to overcome this is to overcome it together. We burn down together, we rebuild together. It's a powerful message. And that's why I say I love the way that Waylon Jones is written here. I've never loved him more in comic books. And so that's where Eddie's just like, I see what you did there. Like, I gotta say, I like the yellow. You're one of us, buddy. Welcome to the mutilation club. But he says, now, just for the sake of argument, what were you thinking that we do about Bruce? And so at that point, we jump into a flashback with Bruce Wayne. Keep in mind, right, one of the things that we learned during the whole Bane arc was that Bruce Wayne wasn't necessarily an enforcer to a degree for Falcone. The idea behind it was that he was supposed to have Waylon Jones take a fall in his fight with Bibbo Babowski. Instead, he turned on that he actually ended up making sure that Waylon Jones won, but then he took all the money and then bet it on Waylon Jones to win. So while everybody made out with a huge chunk of cash, at the end of the day, Falcone felt disrespected. And that disrespect could not be allowed to simply just exist out there in the world. Otherwise, any and everybody would start taking pot shots. And so that's when he went to Bruce and was like, you owe me, right? Either you do what I tell you to do, or I'll take out everybody that you care about. And so Bruce ultimately ended up doing that because he hasn't quite become Batman at this point. And so that's when he's taken to Blackgate. And this is awesome because he's told, take a look at your new abode, son, the beautiful Blackgate prison. And at that point, Bruce is like, I don't understand, right? I thought that I was going to work off my debt. And he's told, you are. And you're going to do it in there. Judge Zappa's going to give you an easy 6 months instead of a hard 6 years. But during that time, you'll be my guy on the inside. And Bruce asks, what am I going to be doing? And he's told, 10% of our business runs through Blackgate. The place has 100 ways to get things in and out. And you are going to learn every single one of them. Now, the reason why this is so cool, and it's something that we've learned over the course of the Absolute Batman line, is that unlike the main DC universe, and that version of Bruce, who's like one of the greatest fighters in existence, right? And is like a master escape artist, and in some capacities, almost on the same level as Scott Free, that he learned all those skills, traveling the world and training with different martial artists and learning all these tricks of the trade. Bruce in the Absolute universe is nowhere near the same level as Batman in the main DC universe, despite the fact that he would still win in a fight. I don't care what anybody says. says. Bruce in the Absolute Universe is not on that same level of fighting prowess. He doesn't know the tricks of the trade. He doesn't know how to pick locks the same way. He's capable. But the cool thing about this is he was learning all these things through crime. He was learning all these things by working as an enforcer. That's how he was able to get in and out of Blackgate prison. It's awesome to see that he's learned these things through a combination of that life as well as working alongside Alfred, who's a merc. Right? He's a soldier of fortune, right, within the Absolute Universe. He's a mercenary. And so at that point, we transition to him meeting with Falcone again, and he's presented a baseball bat. And Bruce just asks, what's this? And he's told, you did a good job in Blackgate, Bruce. It's time to graduate to the bat, right? And he says, I'm not some enforcer, but he's told that's what we all said when it was our turn, right? And he says, at your size, son, don't worry, you will never even have to use it, but everyone has to go through it. You'll do great. It's just a bat, a tool. There is nothing special about it at all. So he's literally fallen down this path of becoming a pretty brutal guy. And so after taking off from Blackgate prison and learning everything with Absolute Scarecrow, he calls out to Alfred, right? Like, are you there? And Alfred's like, kid, thank God, right? Where are you? And Bruce just says, he killed him right in front of me, and I couldn't stop it. It was just like Mr. Gordon. And he doesn't quite finish the statement, but it sounded like he was gonna say, and just like my dad. And Alfred asks him who he's talking about, and Bruce doesn't answer, which I was actually kind of hoping he would, because then Alfred would start spilling more information on Scarecrow. No doubt he will at some point. But when Bruce doesn't say anything, Alfred's like, what in the bloody hell is going on? And Bruce is like, I don't know anymore. But as he's taking off, he's immediately confronted by the Robins, right? Stop. By the authority of the Robin Initiative, you are under arrest. And he takes off, right? And it's like, Robin 2, do you have him? And they say, yes, I've got him. Robin 2, opening fire, right? They literally open fire on Bruce. No questions asked. Now, of course, he's bobbing and weaving and swerving in between the bullets and all that kind of stuff. And in fact, Jason Todd almost hits another Robin, right? But at that point, Bruce is basically on the ground level. Like literally, he crashes into the ground when they shoot through his wings. And it's like, ground team, close in. Robin 3. And Robin 3 is like, I've got him. Which seemingly, this is Tim Drake. It's kind of hard to keep track of who's who because of all the R4s and R5s and all that kind of stuff. But still, right, Duke and Stephanie close in on him. And once he's surrounded, right, he's told, Batman, you would be wise to stay down. And Alfred just says, kid, get out of there. You gotta run as fast as you can. And he just says, no. And so he confronts these Robins and they say, all right then, Batman, time's up. And so in the next issue, we get to see him fight his Robins. Because with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. If you did, drop a like, cliffhangers. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.